A stranger arrived and vanished without a name. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I can't wait to see them. Let's begin. On the afternoon of the much Benham Spring Fete, the village appeared determined to prove that nothing of consequence ever truly happened there. The bunting, faded from previous years but freshly ironed, fluttered obediently along the green. Mrs. Hobson's Victoria sponge sat beside Mrs. Dale's lemon drizzle in an arrangement that suggested both rivalry and long memory. Children ran in tight, shrieking circles around the maypole, and the vicar's wife stood smiling bravely beneath a sunshade that had not matched anything she owned since 1987. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the rose arbor with a paper cup of tea cooling in her hands, observed it all with gentle approval. It was precisely the sort of afternoon, she reflected, that encouraged people to forget themselves, and when people forgot themselves, they revealed quite a great deal. She was in the midst of considering this when she noticed the visitor. He did not belong to much Benham. Miss Marple was quite certain of that at once. It was not merely that she had never seen him before, though that alone would have been telling enough in a village where unfamiliar faces were noted before unfamiliar shoes. It was something subtler. The man stood slightly apart from the others, near the white-painted trestle table where raffle tickets were being sold, yet he did not buy one. He watched the crowd with a polite attentiveness that never quite became engagement. He seemed as though he were studying a picture rather than participating in it. He was neatly dressed, but not fashionably so. His coat was good quality, his shoes well kept but practical. His hair, dark, streaked faintly with grey, was brushed carefully back, revealing a face that was agreeable without being memorable. One might have said later that he looked like a man who could pass through a great many places without leaving a mark. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Across the green, the visitor exchanged a few words with Mrs. Dale, who would certainly have remembered if he had given his name. He laughed at something Mr. Peters said by the tombola stall, though Mr. Peters would later be quite unable to recall what it was. He accepted a cup of tea from young Eleanor Finch, thanking her warmly, and then, curiously, did not drink it. More than one pair of eyes followed him, though few did so consciously. There was something about him that invited attention while discouraging inquiry. Miss Marple, however, had long ago learned that such people were often the most dangerous. The fete continued. A brass band from the neighboring village struck up valiantly. The vicar prepared to announce the winner of the cake competition. Mrs. Hobson adjusted her hat, and then Mrs. Grant screamed. It was not a dramatic scream, no theatrical flourish, but a sharp, sudden sound that cut through the polite music and conversation like a knife through cake. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. He's fallen, Mrs. Grant said, one hand pressed to her chest, the other pointing toward the narrow lane behind the church hall. There was a brief, almost dreadful hesitation, the kind that occurs when people are not yet certain whether they are permitted to react. Then they did. Several villagers hurried toward the lane. Others followed at a more cautious distance, their expressions already rearranging themselves into something suitable for later retelling. Miss Marple rose carefully, placing her cup aside, and joined the procession. The visitor lay at the foot of the low stone wall, partially obscured by a flowering currant bush. At first glance, it might indeed have appeared that he had simply fallen, an unfortunate misstep, a sudden faintness. His hat lay a few inches from his hand. His eyes were closed. His face was very pale. But Miss Marple noticed at once what others did not: the careful placement of the body, the absence of any expression of surprise, and, most telling of all, in the faint, peculiar tightness around the mouth. Something she had once observed in a woman from St. Mary Mead who had been very quietly poisoned by her own niece. "Is he?" someone whispered. Dr. Collins, who had been midway through a slice of Victoria sponge when the scream sounded, knelt down and felt for a pulse. He did not linger long. "I'm afraid he's dead," he said. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by a soft, spreading murmur. Shock, excitement, fear, and a curious, undeniable thrill. "Who is he?" Mrs. Dale asked. No one answered. Miss Marple looked around at the gathered faces. Faces she knew well, faces that were already beginning to arrange themselves into innocence, concern, or curiosity. "He didn't give his name," Eleanor Finch said slowly, as if trying the idea out for the first time. I'm quite sure he didn't." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes," she thought, "that, I suspect, is going to be very important indeed." For a moment, no one moved, as though the village itself had been struck motionless by the impossibility of death occurring so close to the cake stall and the maypole. Then Mrs. Hobson, whose sense of propriety was as sturdy as her sponge, said in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Well, we can't just stand here." That seemed to give everyone permission. Someone, Miss Marple could not later remember who, though she was sure it had been one of the younger men eager to be useful, ran toward the village hall to telephone for the police. Mrs. Grant began to cry in short bursts, more from shock than grief, and was immediately shepherded away by two women who had already decided she would faint if left unattended. Dr. Collins rose to his feet with an air of brisk annoyance, as though death had inconvenienced him personally. "It could have been his heart," he said. "These things do happen." He wiped his hands on a handkerchief, and Miss Marple noticed that he did so rather thoroughly, as if eager to remove the feel of the stranger from his skin. But he was only just standing there, Eleanor Finch protested, looking down at the pale face near the wall. Eleanor was a tall, earnest girl. Miss Marple had always thought her too earnest for her own comfort, who assisted at the post office and believed the world ought to make sense if one looked at it hard enough. "He didn't seem ill. He thanked me for the tea and didn't drink it," Miss Marple supplied gently. Eleanor blinked. No, he didn't. He held it, and then he set it down. I thought perhaps he was distracted. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, he knew better than to drink what had been offered to him. A small, uneasy rustle went through the group. People did not like the suggestion of design. Accidents were comfortable, intent was not. Mr. Peters, florid and important as chairman of the fete committee, puffed himself up. "We ought to preserve the scene," he declared, sounding very much like someone who had listened to a great deal of wireless drama. "No one must touch anything." "I've already touched him," Dr. Collins said with a faint glare. "Yes, well," Mr. Peters said, slightly deflated. He looked around as if searching for someone to blame. His eyes landed on Miss Marple, but only briefly. Miss Marple's air of mild interest seldom offered a satisfying target. "Who saw him go back here?" asked Mrs. Dale, who was not going to allow a tragedy to proceed without her full participation. "He was over by the raffle table a few minutes ago. I remember him perfectly, such nice manners, though I did think his accent was not quite ours." "What sort of accent?" asked Mrs. Grant, reappearing with a damp face and an eagerness that suggested she had recovered enough to be useful. Mrs. Dale pursed her lips. "Well, I couldn't say. Not foreign, exactly. But perhaps London, or one of those places where they speak very fast." "Perhaps he came to see someone," said Mr. Whitby, the butcher, who liked motives to be simple and physical. "If so, they ought to come forward." Several people nodded, looking about them with sudden suspicion, as though the murderer, if there was one, would raise a hand and say quite politely that yes, he had done it. But Miss Marple stepped a fraction closer to the body, careful not to appear as though she had any right to do so. She let her gaze rest on what lay near the man's left hand, a small scrap of paper, folded once. It was pale, almost the color of dust, and might easily have been mistaken for a leaf. No one else was looking at it. They were looking at his face, his shoes, his hat, anything that helped them form a picture suitable for gossip. The paper was too small, too trivial. Miss Marple bent as if to adjust her own cardigan cuff and saw that the paper was blank on the side facing upward. Its edge was torn, as if hastily ripped from something larger. A voice behind her said sharply, "Miss Marple, do be careful." She turned to find Reverend Basil Grant, the vicar, approaching with the stiff gait of a man who had been forced out of his comfortable assumptions. His wife hovered behind him, her hand pressed to her mouth. "I'm sure I shall be quite all right," Miss Marple said. "It's dreadful, isn't it? Poor man, and no one knows who he is." The vicar's face tightened. "That is what disturbs me, to die among strangers." "Perhaps he wasn't among strangers," Miss Marple said softly. The vicar stared at her, but before he could answer, the distant sound of a motor car came up the lane. Several heads turned at once, and there was an unmistakable flutter of relief. Authority had arrived. The village could now hand the terror to someone else. The car stopped near the church gate, and two figures emerged. Sergeant Pritchard, the local policeman, whose round face always suggested he was about to apologize for existing, and behind him, Inspector Slack, larger, more angular, and faintly irritated by the very idea that much venom had demanded his attention. Slack's gaze swept the gathered villagers with practiced impatience. All right, stand back. Give us room." He looked down at the body, then up again. "Who found him?" Mrs. Grant surged forward, eager as ever to be central. "I did, Inspector. I was coming round to fetch more cups from the hall and I saw him lying there. I screamed, well, I did, I'm afraid, and then everyone came." Slack grunted. "And who is he?" A small silence. "No one knows," Mrs. Dale said, as if offering a particularly juicy morsel. "He just appeared at the fete. Very polite, asked about the raffle. Spoke to several of us." Slack's eyes narrowed. "No one got a name?" "Not one person." There was a faint shuffle. People looked at one another, suddenly uneasy at their collective failure. Eleanor said quietly, "He didn't give it. I served him tea. He thanked me and asked if the vicar would be speaking later, about the church roof. That's all." Slack glanced toward the vicar, who nodded stiffly. "He did ask me," Reverend Grant confirmed. "Only casual conversation. And then he comes back here and drops dead." Slack sniffed. "Very convenient." Dr. Collins cleared his throat, irritated at being ignored. "As I said, Inspector, it could have been natural. Heart failure, sudden collapse. He is not a young man." Slack shot him a look. "And you're certain he's dead?" Dr. Collins colored. "Of course I'm certain." Slack crouched, studying the body with more attention than most villagers had ever given anything. Miss Marple watched him. He was not stupid, she thought, only impatient, and impatience often led to unfortunate shortcuts. Slack straightened. "Any sign of struggle?" "No," said Sergeant Pritchard, who had begun to look for footprints with the earnestness of someone searching for a lost sixpence. Slack's eyes moved to the hat, then to the wall. "He falls. He hits his head. But there's no blood," Eleanor said. Slack's mouth tightened. He did not like being corrected by a girl from the post office. Miss Marple, however, had seen enough of Inspector Slack over the years to know that he resented contradiction chiefly because it slowed him down. He preferred conclusions that came quickly and neatly. He glanced at the table by the lane where, earlier, the villagers had set down refreshments for those working behind the church hall. A paper cup sat there, forgotten, with a faint ring of tea stain at its rim. "Whose cup is that?" Slack asked. Eleanor's face went pale. It might be the one I gave him." Slack moved toward it, and Miss Marple felt something tighten inside her, not fear precisely, but a recognition that the next few moments would matter. "Don't touch it," Dr. Collins said automatically, remembering Mr. Peters's earlier drama. Slack ignored him and leaned close, sniffing. Then he looked at Eleanor again, and his voice softened only slightly. You served him tea. Did you put anything in it? Sugar? Milk? Of course I did, Eleanor said, horrified. Milk and 1 sugar, just as he asked. Slack's gaze flicked over her, weighing her, yet Miss Marple knew at once what he was thinking. A young woman, flustered, near the body, connected to the last thing the stranger touched. A convenient thread, and convenient threads were always tempting to men like Inspector Slack. Miss Marple said, in the mildest tone imaginable, "Oh dear, how unfortunate. Though it is curious, isn't it, that he didn't drink it? People so often do, even if they're distracted." Slack looked at her, recognizing her now with the faint irritation of someone who had once been embarrassed by an elderly lady in St. Mary Mead. "Miss Marple," he said, as if that explained everything. She offered him a small, placid smile. "I only meant, Inspector, that if it were the tea, well, it would have had to work very quickly." And he walked about quite normally afterward. Slack's eyes narrowed again, not at the logic, but at the implication that the logic might matter. Before he could respond, Sergeant Pritchard said, "Inspector, there's something else." He was pointing at the dead man's jacket. One of the pockets bulged slightly, as though something had been tucked inside hastily. Slack's expression sharpened. "All right, let's see what our nameless visitor brought with him." Inspector Slack reached into the pocket with an air of faint distaste, as though whatever he found might stain his fingers. The villagers leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Even those who professed squeamishness could not resist the moment when the dead yielded their secrets. He withdrew a leather wallet. It was plain, well-used, and unremarkable, much like the man himself. Slack opened it briskly, thumbing through the contents while Sergeant Pritchard peered over his shoulder. There were several banknotes folded neatly, a railway ticket, creased but unused, from Paddington to a small station 2 stops beyond Much Benham, and a visiting card. Slack held the card up between 2 fingers. It was blank. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. "Nothing at all?" Mrs. Dale said, incredulous. "Not even initials?" Slack turned it over as if the name might be hiding on the back. "Nothing." Miss Marple watched his face closely. She had seen that look before, the irritation of a man deprived of an easy answer. A name would have given him direction. Without it, the case spread outward, untidy and inconvenient. "There must be something else," Mr. Peters said, with the air of someone who felt mysteries ought to behave properly. Sir Slack ignored him and continued his search. He found a handkerchief, neatly folded, a small key on a plain ring. No address, no letters, no notebook, no photograph of a loved one tucked sentimentally away. "A man without attachments," Slack muttered, "or one who didn't want them found." Miss Marple thought of the scrap of paper near the body and felt a small, private certainty settle in her mind. People who wished to be found did not tear paper. People who wished to vanish often did. Slack snapped the wallet shut. "All right. Sergeant, see that the body's taken to the mortuary. We'll have a proper post-mortem. If this was poison, we'll know soon enough." There was a faint, collective exhale. Science, villagers believed, would make sense of what they could not. "And until then," Mrs. Hobson asked, "what are we meant to do?" Slack looked around at the assembled faces. Familiar, respectable, faintly resentful of intrusion. "You'll all stay exactly where you are. I want statements from everyone who spoke to him." A ripple of protest rose at once. "But, Inspector, I have a roast in the oven. I only exchanged a word." Slack raised a hand. "One at a time." Miss Marple watched as the crowd rearranged itself into clusters of sudden importance. Conversations replayed themselves inwardly, each villager polishing their own innocence. She noticed, too, the subtle shifts, the way Mrs. Dale edged closer to Mrs. Hobson, the way Mr. Whitby crossed his arms, the way Eleanor Finch stood very still, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Miss Marple moved quietly to Eleanor's side. "You mustn't distress yourself, my dear," she said kindly. "None of this is your fault." Eleanor swallowed. "I keep thinking, if I'd insisted he drink the tea, or if I'd asked his name." Miss Marple shook her head. People who don't give their names rarely do so by accident. Eleanor looked at her sharply. "You think he meant to hide?" Miss Marple smiled vaguely. "I think people often hide the most when they are quite certain they are about to be found." Nearby, Slack had begun questioning Mrs. Dale, who was enjoying herself immensely. "He asked about the raffle," she said, "and whether the vicar would be speaking. Perfectly ordinary questions, though I did think he was listening more than he talked." Slack scribbled something in his notebook. "And you didn't ask who he was?" "Well, no. One doesn't, does one? It would seem rude." Slack grunted, unconvinced, though Miss Marple let her gaze wander again to the spot where the man had fallen. The body was still there, though now partially shielded by Sergeant Pritchard's conscientious attempts at crowd control. The scrap of paper lay where it had been, unnoticed still. She waited. It was always tempting in moments like these to speak too soon. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people revealed far more when allowed to do so at their own pace. The questioning continued. Mr. Peters had noticed the visitor's shoes. Very sensible, I thought. Mrs. Grant recalled that he'd asked where the church records were kept. Just idle curiosity, I'm sure. The vicar admitted that the man had seemed particularly interested in the history of much Benham. He asked how long certain families had lived here. At that, and Miss Marple felt a faint stirring of satisfaction. Inspector Slack paused in his notes. "Which families?" Reverend Grant hesitated. "Well, he mentioned the Whitbys and the Dales, and—" He glanced, almost involuntarily, toward Miss Marple. "The old Renshaw property?" A silence fell, heavier than the others. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a compliment. "That house has been empty for years," Mr. Peters said quickly. "Ever since the fire." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "people remember it very well." Slack looked at her sharply. "You know something about this?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, "only that villagers have very long memories. Longer, sometimes, than people expect." Slack returned to the vicar. "Did he say why he was asking about these families?" "No," Reverend Grant said, "only that he found local history fascinating." "Did he?" Mrs. Dale said with sudden sharpness. I didn't care for the way he said it, now that I think of it, as though he knew more than he was letting on. Miss Marple noticed how easily memory reshaped itself once suspicion entered. Sergeant Pritchard approached quietly. "Inspector, Dr. Collins says the body can be moved now." Slack nodded. "Good." As the stretcher was brought forward, Miss Marple saw her moment slipping away. Once the body was gone, so too would be the small details that mattered most. She stepped forward, her voice mild and apologetic. "Inspector, I do hope you won't think me interfering, but I believe the gentleman dropped something." Slack frowned. "Dropped something?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, pointing with her umbrella to the scrap of paper near the wall. "It's been there all along. I imagine it fell from his pocket when he collapsed." Slack followed her gesture. His frown deepened, then shifted into something more alert. He bent and picked up the paper carefully, using his handkerchief this time. "It's blank," he said. "On one side," Miss Marple agreed. "But people rarely tear paper for no reason." Slack turned it over slowly. His eyes narrowed. There, faint but unmistakable, was the impression of writing, an address or name pressed hard enough on the original sheet to leave its ghost behind. Slack straightened. "Well," he said slowly, "it seems our visitor did leave something after all." Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Yes," she said. "I rather thought he meant to." Inspector Slack studied the faint indentation with renewed interest. He held the paper up to the light. angling it this way and that, as though the ghost of the words might obligingly darken out of consideration for his patience. "Can you make it out?" Sergeant Pritchard asked. Slack shook his head. "Not clearly. But it's something. An address, I'd say, or a name." He slipped the scrap into an evidence envelope with exaggerated care, then looked around at the villagers again, his expression sharper now, more intent. "Which of you knows anything about the Renshaw house?" The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Mrs. Dale's mouth tightened. Mr. Peters cleared his throat. Reverend Grant looked faintly troubled. And at the far edge of the group, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Whitby's hand close suddenly over her husband's arm, as though anchoring him in place. "It's hardly relevant," Mr. Peters said quickly. "So that business was settled years ago." "Settled for whom?" Slack asked. Mr. Peters flushed. "Well, for the village." Miss Marple thought how often villagers believed that forgetting was the same as settling. Slack gestured toward the lane. "Let's clear this up indoors. Church Hall, I'll speak to you one by one." There was a subdued shuffle as people obeyed, the fete quite forgotten now. Cakes sat unattended, prizes unclaimed. The bunting fluttered on, cheerfully indifferent. Inside the hall, the villagers were arranged along the walls on folding chairs, like a jury without a case, or perhaps with too many. Slack set himself up at the trestle table near the front, Sergeant Pritchard at his side, notebook ready. Dr. Collins hovered, eager to be consulted, and Eleanor Finch sat stiffly near the door, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. So Miss Marple chose a seat near the middle, where she could see everyone without appearing to watch too closely. Slack began again with Mrs. Dale, who repeated herself with embellishments that grew subtly more dramatic each time. Then Mrs. Grant, then Mr. Peters. Each account overlapped, contradicted, or shaded the last, and Miss Marple listened with quiet interest. Truth, she had found, was rarely found whole in any one person's telling. At last, Slack turned to Reverend Grant. "You said he asked about the Renshaw property. Tell me exactly what he said." The vicar hesitated, then spoke slowly. "He asked who lived there before the fire. I told him the house had belonged to the Renshaw family for generations, until Miss Margaret Renshaw died. And after her death, the house was left empty. There was some confusion over the will. So distant relatives, I believe. Then the fire destroyed most of it." Slack's pen paused. "And did anyone here benefit from that?" A murmur ran through the room. "That's an unfair question," Mrs. Hobson said sharply. Slack looked at her. "Is it?" Silence answered him. Miss Marple felt the atmosphere shift again. Not toward fear this time, but toward something more defensive. Old matters had been disturbed, and people disliked that far more than sudden tragedy. Slack continued, his voice level. "Did the visitor mention Miss Margaret Renshaw by name?" The vicar frowned. "Now that you ask, yes. Yes, he did." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "What did he say?" Slack pressed. "He asked what sort of woman she had been," Reverend Grant said. "I told him she was quiet, kept to herself, very private." Mrs. Dale gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Private indeed. That's one way of putting it." Slack swung toward her at once. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Dale colored. "Nothing improper, only that she wasn't sociable, didn't attend fetes, didn't invite people in. Some thought her odd." "Odd enough to make enemies?" Slack asked. Mrs. Dale hesitated. "Well, she did dismiss her housekeeper rather suddenly. There was that business with—" "With what?" Slack snapped. Mrs. Dale glanced around, enjoying the attention despite herself. "With her nephew." Miss Marple saw several heads turn sharply. "Which nephew?" Slack asked. Mrs. Dale shrugged. "I couldn't say. A nephew from London, I believe. He visited her a few times years ago. They quarreled, so people said. After that, he never came again." Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the visitor's face. Agreeable, unmemorable, so carefully neutral. A man who could pass for many things, including a nephew, returned quietly to settle unfinished business. Slack leaned back slightly. Interesting? He turned next to Mr. Whitby. You've lived here all your life, I'm told. That's right, Mr. Whitby said gruffly. Did you know Miss Renshaw? Well enough, Whitby said. She bought meat from my father, then from me. Ever see this visitor before? Slack asked. Whitby hesitated, just long enough to matter. No. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation. Others did too. Slack's eyes narrowed. You're sure? Whitby shifted. Well, no, that is, I can't be certain. He looked familiar, but faces do. Yes, Miss Marple murmured inwardly. They do. Slack pressed on, but Whitby gave nothing more. The questioning moved on, but the unease remained, spreading quietly. At last, Slack closed his notebook with a snap. All right, that'll do for now. No one is to leave the village until further notice. A ripple of protest rose, but Slack cut it short. I mean it. Whoever this man was, he came here for a reason, and I intend to find out what it was. He glanced briefly at Miss Marple, then away again, as though refusing to acknowledge how often she was present at moments like this. The villagers were dismissed in small groups, conversation starting up at once, speculation already racing ahead of evidence. Miss Marple rose slowly and made her way toward the door. Eleanor Finch lingered there, pale and uncertain. Miss Marple, she said softly, do you really think he was poisoned? Miss Marple considered her before answering. I think, she said gently, that he was very careful. Careful people often believe they have accounted for every risk, but they sometimes forget one thing. What's that? Eleanor asked. Human nature, Miss Marple said. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted. The fete lay in disarray, half packed away, as though the village itself were uncertain how to proceed. Miss Marple paused near the lane where the man had fallen. The body was gone now, leaving only a darker patch of earth and the faint impression of absence. She thought of the torn paper, the blank card, the careful questions about old families and older grudges, of the way certain names had tightened faces. Whoever the visitor had been, he had not come to Much Benham by chance, and whoever had ensured he left it without a name had known exactly what that name meant. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and turned back toward the village. The past, she reflected, had a most inconvenient habit of refusing to stay buried. That evening, Much Benham behaved like a village under curfew, though no official one had been declared. Doors closed earlier than usual. Curtains twitched with an energy normally reserved for thunderstorms or scandal. Conversations were held in lower voices, and more than one kettle was boiled only to be forgotten, left to cool untouched. Miss Marple returned to her cottage just as the light was beginning to fail. She lit a lamp, set her hat carefully on its peg, and allowed herself the small luxury of sitting down before she removed her shoes. Her cat, a creature of limited sympathy, regarded her with mild reproach for being late with supper. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, attending to the saucer. It has been rather a day. As she straightened, there was a knock at the door, tentative, then repeated with a little more determination. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Days like this always brought visitors. It was Eleanor Finch, wrapped in a coat she had clearly put on without much thought. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of anxiety and relief. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Eleanor said. Not at all, Miss Marple replied. Come in, my dear. You look as though you could use a cup of tea. Eleanor accepted gratefully and sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment she said nothing, as though unsure where to begin. I can't stop thinking about him, she said at last, about the questions he asked. It's as if he came here knowing exactly what to say. Miss Marple poured the tea slowly. People who ask questions are rarely as innocent as they seem, but especially when they ask the right ones. Eleanor looked up sharply. You think he knew about Miss Renshaw? Oh, I'm quite sure of it, Miss Marple said mildly. And about the people connected to her. Eleanor hesitated. Inspector Slack asked me something before I left the hall. He wanted to know if the man had said anything else to me. I told him no, but that isn't quite true. Miss Marple did not react at once. She stirred her tea, waiting. He said, Eleanor continued, lowering her voice, that villages were like families, that secrets didn't disappear, they only changed hands. Miss Marple nodded. That sounds very much like someone who believed he was entitled to answers. Eleanor shivered. Do you think he was her nephew? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that he believed himself wronged. Whether he was truly her nephew, or merely wished to be thought so, remains to be seen. Eleanor frowned. But if that's true, if he came here to stir things up, why kill him? Wouldn't it have been easier to ignore him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, that assumes he was killed to silence him. There are other possibilities. Before Eleanor could ask what they were, another knock sounded at the door, this one firmer, more official. Inspector Slack stood outside, his coat collar turned up, his expression set in lines that suggested he had not enjoyed his afternoon. I thought I might find you here, he said without apology. Miss Marple stepped aside. How very efficient of you, Inspector. Do come in. Slack's eyes flicked to Eleanor. Am I interrupting? Only tea, Miss Marple said, which you are welcome to join. Slack declined with a grunt, but entered, arm standing rather than sitting. We've had a preliminary report from the pathologist. And? Miss Marple asked. Slack's mouth tightened. Cause of death was poisoning, a fast-acting alkaloid, colorless, tasteless, could have been administered in food or drink. Eleanor went pale. The tea? Possibly, Slack said, though not necessarily. The poison could have been taken earlier. Miss Marple inclined her head. Did you find anything else? Slack hesitated, then reached into his pocket. We managed to bring out some of the writing from that scrap of paper. Chemical treatment. He unfolded a photograph and handed it to her. The impression was faint but legible now, a name and beneath it an address in London. Thomas Renshaw, Eleanor whispered. Yes, Slack said. So our visitor had a name after all. Miss Marple studied the photograph. Did you check the address? Of course, Slack said. It belongs to a solicitor's office. Renshaw consulted them several years ago about a contested inheritance. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. Miss Margaret Renshaw's estate. Slack nodded. She changed her will shortly before she died. Cut Thomas Renshaw out entirely. Left the bulk of her property to, well, that's where it gets interesting. He paused deliberately. To whom? Eleanor asked. To a trust, Slack said, administered locally. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. How very sensible of her. Sensible, maybe, Slack said, but the trust's beneficiaries include several improvements to the village. The church roof, the village hall, even the fete fund. Eleanor stared. You mean, yes, Slack said grimly. A good many people here benefited, directly or indirectly, from Thomas Renshaw losing his inheritance. Silence settled in the small room, thick with implication. Miss Marple broke it gently. Did Mr. Renshaw know that? Slack's expression darkened. It appears he did. He wrote letters, accusatory ones. Most went unanswered. And so, Miss Marple said, he came in person. Slack looked at her sharply. You think he meant to confront someone? I think, Miss Marple replied, that he meant to confront many people, and that made him dangerous. Eleanor's voice trembled. But who would poison him? Half the village, by the sound of it, had reason to resent him, but not to kill him. Resentment, Miss Marple said softly, is a very flexible emotion. It sharpens quickly when threatened. Slack exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I don't like this. Too many motives, among too many respectable faces. Villages are full of them, Miss Marple said kindly. Slack glanced at her, then away. There's one more thing. Thomas Renshaw didn't arrive today. He arrived last night. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And where did he stay? At the Whitbys' old guest room, Slack said. Paid cash. Left early this morning. Eleanor gasped, but Mr. Whitby said that he wasn't sure if he'd seen the man before. Slack finished, which may have been quite true, or quite false. Miss Marple set the photograph down carefully. The pieces were moving now, aligning themselves into something more coherent and far more dangerous. Thomas Renshaw had returned to Much Benham with old grievances and unfinished business. He had spoken to too many people, asked too many questions, and someone, somewhere between past and present, who had decided that he must not be allowed to finish what he had begun. Miss Marple looked up at Inspector Slack. I think, she said gently, that you will find the answer not in what Mr. Renshaw did today, but in what he reminded people of. Slack met her gaze, his expression grim. Yes, he said slowly. I was afraid you might say that. Outside, the village lay quiet under the darkening sky. But beneath that quiet, old memories stirred, and with them, the unmistakable scent of fear. Inspector Slack left shortly after, his mind clearly occupied with calculations that did not yet add up. Eleanor lingered a little longer, but eventually even she went home, reassured only slightly by Miss Marple's calm presence. When the door finally closed and the cottage settled into silence, Miss Marple sat for a long while without moving, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Thomas Renshaw, she thought. Yes, that name fitted the man very well. She went to bed early, as was her habit, but sleep did not come at once. Villages, she reflected, were rather like family albums. They showed you what people wished to remember and hid the rest between pages that were never opened. Thomas Renshaw had come back to open those pages. That, more than inheritance, had made him dangerous. By morning, Much Benham was once again pretending at normality. Miss Marple observed this carefully as she walked to the post office to collect her letters. Mr. Whitby was already there, his manner brusquer than usual, speaking in short sentences, as though conversation itself might trap him into saying too much. Mrs. Dale stood nearby, alert and eager, clearly hoping to extract information from anyone who looked remotely inclined to supply it. Eleanor Finch handed Miss Marple her post with a small, grateful smile. Inspector Slack has asked me to keep the office open all day, she said quietly, in case anyone comes forward. Indeed, Miss Marple said, though people rarely come forward until they are quite certain they must. As she turned away, she noticed Mrs. Whitby standing very still near the doorway, her face pale beneath her hat. Miss Marple paused. My dear, she said kindly, you look quite worn out. Have you been sleeping? Mrs. Whitby started, as though pulled from unpleasant thoughts. Sleeping? Oh, well enough. She hesitated, then added stiffly. It's all been very upsetting. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Us, especially when the past insists on returning without invitation. Mrs. Whitby's eyes flickered. I don't know what you mean. Of course not, Miss Marple said gently, and moved on. She spent the late morning visiting, as she usually did, calling on Mrs. Hobson, who was already deep into a theory involving strangers and foreign poisons, and then stopping briefly at the vicarage. Reverend Grant was distracted, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. It's extraordinary, he said, pouring tea he scarcely drank. To think that what Margaret Renshaw did all those years ago should return like this. Unresolved matters often do, Miss Marple said, especially when they involve money and feelings. The vicar sighed. She believed she was doing the right thing. Yes, Miss Marple said. That is often how trouble begins. By the time she returned home, No, the village was buzzing again, not loudly, but with a low, continuous hum. Inspector Slack was making calls, Miss Marple knew, asking questions that would be answered with partial truths and careful omissions. And somewhere among those omissions lay the poison. It was shortly after luncheon when she received her next visitor. Mrs. Whitby stood on the threshold this time, her hands clasped tightly together. She did not wait to be invited in. "I didn't kill him," she said abruptly. Miss Marple closed the door quietly behind her. "No one has said that you did." Mrs. Whitby sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "He frightened me. When he came, last night, I knew who he was at once, or what he was." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He asked about the house," Mrs. Whitby said. "About the fire, about Margaret's will. He said it was all coming out now, that the village would have to answer for it." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. "I told my husband not to let him stay," Mrs. Whitby continued. "But Thomas Renshaw was persuasive. He said he only wanted the truth, that he would be satisfied once it was spoken aloud." "And were you?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Whitby shook her head miserably. "No, because the truth is not simple." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It rarely is." Mrs. Whitby looked up sharply. "You know something?" "I know," Miss Marple said gently, "that Margaret Renshaw did not change her will out of spite alone. She believed she was protecting someone." Mrs. Whitby's breath caught. "She believed," Miss Marple went on, "that Thomas Renshaw was not entitled to what he claimed, that his connection to her family was less legitimate than he insisted." Mrs. Whitby's face crumpled. "She told me, years ago. She said if he ever returned, everything would be ruined." "And when he did return," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone decided ruin must be avoided at any cost." Mrs. Whitby covered her face. "It wasn't me," she whispered, "but I know who it could be." Miss Marple waited. "Mrs. Dale," Mrs. Whitby said hoarsely. "She helped Margaret with the papers. She knew what the will really said. She stood to lose everything if Thomas proved his claim false or true. I don't know which frightens me more." Miss Marple rose and poured tea, her movements unhurried. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "Now, my dear, you must leave the rest to me." Mrs. Whitby looked at her desperately. "Will you tell the inspector?" "In time," Miss Marple said. "But first, I must be quite sure." After Mrs. Whitby left, Miss Marple sat very still, her thoughts aligning themselves at last. Thomas Renshaw had not been silenced because he was wronged. He had been silenced because he was right about one thing and disastrously wrong about another, and the person who killed him was someone who believed, with absolute sincerity, that they were preserving the village from a truth it could not bear. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled faintly. Human nature, she reflected once more, was always most dangerous when it believed itself justified. Inspector Slack chose the church hall for the final gathering, partly out of practicality, and partly because there was nowhere else in much Benham large enough to hold both the villagers and the weight of what was about to be said. They came reluctantly, one by one, carrying with them the expressions they had practiced all day: indignation, sorrow, fatigue, innocence. Mrs. Dale sat very straight, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap. Mr. Whitby stared fixedly ahead. Mrs. Whitby kept her eyes lowered. Eleanor Finch hovered near the back, pale but resolute. Miss Marple took a seat slightly to one side, knitting in her hands, her manner so unobtrusive that several people forgot she was there at all. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "We know who the dead man was," he began. "Thomas Renshaw. He came to Much Benham to pursue a grievance connected to his aunt's estate. That much is established." A murmur rippled through the hall, though there was little surprise left to expend. "The poison that killed him," Slack continued, "was administered in tea. We've confirmed that. Eleanor flinched. "But," Slack said firmly, "not at the feet." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Mr. Renshaw was poisoned the night before," Slack went on. "The dose was calculated, slow enough not to incapacitate him immediately, fast enough to ensure death within hours. He collapsed at the fete because that was when the poison finally took full effect." He paused, letting that settle. "This wasn't a crime of panic," he said. "It was planned." Mrs. Dale shifted slightly. "He stayed with the Whitbys," Slack continued. "That gave us opportunity, but opportunity alone isn't enough. He turned then, not to Mrs. Whitby, nor to Mr. Whitby, but to Miss Marple. "You asked to speak," he said, with the faintest edge of reluctance. Miss Marple looked up as if surprised. "Oh dear, did I?" Several villagers stared. Others leaned forward despite themselves. "Well," Miss Marple said mildly, setting her knitting aside, "since you insist, Inspector, perhaps I might explain something that has been troubling me." She rose slowly and moved to the front of the room, her voice gentle but perfectly audible. "Thomas Renshaw believed he had been cheated out of his inheritance," she said. "And in one sense, he was quite right. His aunt did change her will in a most dramatic fashion, but she did so because she believed Thomas himself had committed a deception." Mrs. Dale's lips tightened. "Miss Margaret Renshaw discovered," Miss Marple continued, "that Thomas was not, in fact, her nephew at all, but the son of her brother's former wife, born after their divorce. Legally, he had no claim. Morally, she felt he had tried to force one." A sharp intake of breath came from several quarters. "She confided this to one person," Miss Marple said softly. "A person she trusted. A person who helped her arrange the trust that would benefit the village." All eyes turned, slowly and inevitably, to Mrs. Dale. "That's absurd," Mrs. Dale said sharply. "I was merely her solicitor's intermediary." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And when Thomas Renshaw returned, you knew at once what he meant to do. He intended to expose the truth, or at least his version of it. If he succeeded, the trust could be challenged, the village improvements reversed, your own reputation questioned." Mrs. Dale rose halfway from her chair. "You can't prove?" "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Proof is Inspector Slack's concern. I only concern myself with people." She turned slightly, addressing the room. "Thomas Renshaw frightened many of you, but he terrified only one of you, because only one person knew exactly what he might reveal, and exactly how fragile the story truly was." Mrs. Dale's face had gone pale. "He came to you last night," Miss Marple said. "Not to the Whitbys first, to you. You offered him tea. You spoke calmly, you listened, and you poisoned him." "That's a lie," Mrs. Dale cried. "Why would I let him walk about afterward if I'd done such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because you believed the timing would protect you. You expected him to die quietly, later, somewhere else. And you didn't expect him to insist on attending the fete." Slack stepped forward. "We found traces of the poison in your kitchen, Mrs. Dale. On a spoon you tried to wash too carefully." Mrs. Dale sank back into her chair. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said hoarsely. "He was going to ruin everything, the church, the hall, the village itself. Margaret wanted it protected." "And so did you," Miss Marple said kindly. "That is why you did it." There was a long, heavy silence. At last, Slack spoke. "Mrs. Dale, you're under arrest." As she was led away, the villagers sat stunned, confronted not only with murder, but with the realization that one of their own, so capable, so respectable, had believed herself justified. Slowly, people began to leave. Conversations were hushed now, subdued. The hall emptied. Miss Marple remained seated. Inspector Slack approached her at last, rubbing the back of his neck. "You saw it early, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh no, not early, just steadily." He hesitated. The village will never be quite the same. No, Miss Marple agreed. But then, it never truly is after the truth comes out. One simply learns to live with a clearer view. Outside, the evening was calm. The bunting had been taken down. The green lay quiet once more. Miss Marple walked home at her usual pace, her thoughts already settling. Thomas Renshaw had come seeking justice and found instead the final consequence of human fear. And much Benham would go on, wiser perhaps, but certainly less innocent. At her cottage door, Miss Marple paused and looked back toward the village. People, she reflected, were very much alike everywhere. Given enough time, secrets always surfaced, and when they did, it was never the cleverness of the crime that mattered most, but the simple, dangerous belief that one was right. She went inside, closed the door softly, and put the kettle on.